You're listening to the Forum Podcast, a production of Calvin Theological Seminary. For nearly 150 years, Calvin Seminary has been a thought leader in Reformed faith and scholarship. We invite you to join us and our guests as we wrestle with the questions of mercy, justice, faith, and formation. We do not have all the answers, but we believe how we pursue them matters. This is the Forum Podcast.
This is a previously unreleased episode from our content archives. While some events or references may be dated, we believe the content is just as relevant today as it was when we recorded it, and we think you'll agree. When was the last time you checked your smartphone? Does the mere mention of your phone make you reach for your pocket? If your use of your smartphone borders on addiction, you are not alone. Calvin Seminary held what we called a smartphone retreat, a week-long series of exercises and practices designed to help us answer the questions: how much and how well do we use our smartphones? And what are the positives and negative effects they have on us? Jeff Sajdak, Dean of Students at Calvin Seminary, and Aaron Einfeld, Director of Lifelong Learning at Calvin Seminary, planned and facilitated the week. Our then Educational Technologist, Nathan Bierma, talked to them about why they started the smartphone retreat and what they learned.
We're joined now by Jeff Sajdak and Aaron Einfeld. Jeff and Aaron, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, nice to be here.
So, Jeff, this idea was inspired by a TED-Talk by Manoush Zomorodi, and we'll post this in our show notes so our listeners can follow up and find it. But she's the host of the Note to Self podcast. She gave this TED-Talk, and it's since become a book, Bored and Brilliant. Explain a little bit her idea. What is the problem she diagnoses, and what are the solutions she suggests?
Manoush Zomorodi in her podcast and other work tries to look at technology and how it affects us in our daily living. And one of the things that she discovered, she had a child that was born about the same time the iPhone was invented, and discovered that people are not getting bored like they used to. Anytime they have a moment, instead of waiting, they pull out their phones and they start dealing with apps, and they never have moments to be creative. And discovered there's a lot of things that happen in our brains and other places, but basically the fact that we don't have time to just be quiet, to wait, to be bored, is diminishing our ability to be creative and live into the experiences that are all around us. I heard that, and with my pastoral experience, my interest in spiritual formation, said, I think this is not just about creativity. I think this is about whether we can appreciate God's presence in the world all around us, whether we're noticing God in every moment that's there, instead of looking for God, noticing God in other people, in conversations, or in just looking at the people in the world around us. We're missing God because we're looking at our phones.
Aaron, you've done doctoral work on technology or online technology and liberal arts education, and you're interested in these broader questions in this technological moment, this technological era that we're in. What are some of the larger questions about technology that you're asking and you're interested in, and how do they connect to this idea?
I think it's first important to say and point out that, smartphones have only been around for about a decade, and if you look at the significant impact and proliferation that they've had into our lives, it's really kind of a breakneck speed of technological adoption of these powerful tools. And I think there's a lot we don't know yet. And you read about this in the literature. I think people are starting to research the effect that technology is having on our lives, but it's just so new. There's just so much that we don't know. And one example for me that I've studied is online learning. And so there's, for a long time, of course, education has been a place where people physically convene together, and there's really special, important things that happen when people gather in a classroom, develop relationships, foster the things that they realize they're going to fall in love with. And online learning has come very quickly, and some people are very skeptical of online learning and think that it might be depersonalizing, and that you might not be able to get some of the outcomes that we've had in the past, like becoming good citizens, becoming empathic, developing relational skills, some of these soft skills. So that's really my interest. Can online learning actually be effective in some of these bigger outcomes that we're looking for, aside from just gaining content knowledge that you could read on a screen. But where it's really kind of taken me is being much more interested in generally how technology and tools are shaping our lives.
And that point about how sudden this all is, you mentioned the iPhone turned 10 years old last year, and it struck me that one of the biggest benefits of this is just to stop and take stock of this and to measure what has happened in the last 10 years that we may not have noticed because it's so sudden. And Jeff, you talked about making that connection to spiritual practices and spiritual dangers. What are the potential dangers, the potential spiritual cost of the way we've allowed smartphone technology to infiltrate our daily life?
Well, it can affect us in a lot of different ways. We need to be careful. The fact that we create these new technologies in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how do we use these as tools rather than letting them control us. So some of the things that we miss are relational aspects, where we're spending our time looking at a phone instead of talking with the people that are around us. The image that I have seen numerous times is young people all gathered together for some event, and they're all looking at their phones, and nobody's interacting with one another. They're together, but they're not. The phones can bring us together, bridge distances, but sometimes when we're right with people, we're missing the very community that God has given us in that place and in that moment. I think with that whole notion of bored and brilliant, I think we're missing that opportunity to be aware of ourselves, aware of the wonders of creation, aware of things that are influencing us day by day. We're caught up by looking at Facebook or checking our Instagram feed or whatever else may be coming our way instead of pausing to talk to our neighbor, to talk with God, to just become a little bit more aware of self and surroundings.
So you adapted these ideas, again, from Bored and Brilliant by Manoush Zomorodi to this idea of a smartphone retreat here at Calvin Seminary. And the first step was to have participants install an app that would help us make us more aware of our phone habits. Aaron, you found an app called Moment for iPhone, and I believe there's one called Quality Time for Android. Could you just explain what these apps do?
Yes. So these apps, you install them on your phone, and essentially what they do is track your usage, overall time that you are on your phone, and then divide it up by the different apps that you use so you can see which apps are being used the amount of the most and the least. It also tracks the number of times you pick up your phone and check your phone, which for many people is very surprising. Without being too negative about phones, it has been proven that they are very addictive devices. And so it's not necessarily that they're bad in and of themselves, but it's how can we kind of mitigate it against these addictive properties. So really the goal was to just raise self-awareness to how long am I using my phone each day, and how many times do I pick it up, and what are the apps that I spend the most time on?
And that first step, even before the retreat got started, was a real eye-opener for me, especially just the daily pickups. If you had asked me before this, how many times a day do you pick up your phone, I'd say, maybe a dozen, maybe a couple dozen. And I underestimated it was more than double that. We had students who I think confessed that they approached triple digits per day. And it made me stop and think, first of all, there are that many moments in a day that I have where I have some kind of downtime or some kind of space that I just instinctively fill. And so just the awareness that these apps bring toward how habitually and how we're not even aware of how we're filling our time that way. So one of the first exercises, we had one exercise per day for this week where we had the smartphone retreat. And the first one was simply, sort of for the reasons we just said, to keep your phone out of reach, not put it away entirely, but explain what this exercise was and why it was suggested.
Yeah, the intent behind this one is just to leave some of those spaces in your life to be aware. So what we encourage people to do was anytime that you are moving, to not have your phone accessible. So if you're driving, if you're walking to class, whatever that may be, if you're moving, put it in a bag, put it away, put it someplace else so that you have at least some space in your life where you're not interacting. And for me personally, this was probably the most powerful of the days. It was the first one that we did, but I would leave my smartphone in my office, and whenever I'd go to a meeting or go somewhere else in the building, it was left behind. And the first couple days that I did that, I had this panic that I was going to be in some meeting and I was going to need to pull up my calendar, or I was going to need to find something else that was in my phone, and I would be exposed for not knowing something. And the reality I've discovered is I generally don't need that, at least not nearly as often as I think I do. So, in fact, right now I'm here and my phone is back in my office, so I have no idea if there's anything on my Twitter feed or somebody sent me an email. But what it allowed for me to do is when I'm in a meeting, when I'm visiting with a student, when I'm sitting in a student center, wherever I may be, I can be present for that person. I don't have to be worried about, has my phone just vibrated and do I need to check and see what that was all about? It gave me that space to say, I have some freedom. And I think some of the others found a similar sort of thing. There was one student who commented that he used to see that time leaving the classroom and heading to the student center was the time that he could check his emails, that he could send some quick texts and try to type them on the way, figuring he was being a good steward of his time by doing that. And when he tried this first exercise, he discovered that he was actually meeting people on the hallway. He was having conversations with people along the way, and that was a lot better for him than trying to quickly get off a text during those few moments. So, yeah, for at least the two of us, that was an insightful moment that we don't need that smartphone all the time, alerting us, prompting us, distracting us. We can pay attention to the people around us.
Another exercise was to delete that app. What were some of the apps that students reported was that app for them? And to what extent is the dominance that these smartphones have over the rhythms of our daily life, to what extent do they sometimes boil down to that single app?
Well, I can just speak for myself, I guess, is that I deleted the Facebook app on my phone. I don't actually post very much on Facebook, but I'm one of those that probably just scrolls through looking for news and interesting stories. And when I deleted that app, I realized that I was just looking to my phone many times throughout the day for a hit of something interesting. And so it's actually, it releases chemicals in your brain, and it's a nice high, actually, that you get from that. The problem is, and I've read about this, is that a lot of social media use is connected to depression and anxiety, and people feel poorly about themselves after spending lots of time looking on their news feeds because it's fake. I can think of many times where people posted something about their spring break trip, but then you talk about them to them afterwards, and you hear actually they were fighting with their spouse the whole time, or they just captured the good moments. And so there's this sense that everybody else must have it together. Everybody else is more interesting. Other people got together for breakfast with their friends, and I didn't. So it just can kind of be a habit of feeling poorly about yourself. So something I did then was, under the recommendation of Andy Crouch in his book, The Tech-Wise Family, he says, just do something in the morning other than look at your phone. Just do one thing. And that has been actually a really big thing for me. I've spent 10 minutes or so reading the Proverbs and centering my day, and it's just had a big influence on my life. It's not that I've gotten rid of my phone. I still think there's a lot of benefit to connectivity, but that was a big insight for myself anyway.
And we think of it, well, it seems so harmless just to look at pictures of my friends. That doesn't seem like something so problematic. But again, it's how selective it is, and then that emotion that it seems to unconsciously arouse in us, which is they all seem to have everything together and I don't. And that creates strong emotions. Jeff, toward the later part of the week, you turned us to a more spiritual focus on spiritual disciplines, including having smartphone alerts as a call to prayer, and even some echoes of kind of medieval monastic practices, praying the hours, the rhythm of prayer throughout daily life. So this is an example not of minimizing smartphone presence in our life, but redirecting it toward a different kind of result.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to make the technology work for us, to, as you said, a call to prayer, a call to awareness of our day, of our moment, to center ourselves once again. I know for some it was used at certain hours as that call for the daily hours, the divine office, whatever that might be. For some it was just a little prompting, a little reminder that This is a call to remember that this day is God's day. God has prepared this place for me, and I can enter into it. I can enter into it prayerfully. I can notice where God has been in my day. So just a little prompt, a little note to say, oh yeah, the smartphone is helping me remember God's presence instead of distracting me from it, from all of the different apps and such that call for my attention.
So we did this during Lent, and the question might arise, why not do a smartphone fast instead of a smartphone retreat? Why not go cold turkey? If these phones are as problematic as we say they are, why try to reorient instead of try to remove?
I think for some people that might be what they would need to or desire to do, that they may look at the days of Lent and say, for Lent I'm giving up, whether it's a particular app or the smartphone or whatever that may be. And I think there's a place for that. When you're dealing with something that is addictive, that's calling for your attention, that's distracting you, sometimes the best thing is to just put it aside. But I think we're coming at this from a recognition that all the world belongs to God. And so this technology that has been created has a place and it has a value. There are good things that come from having a smartphone. Much as I long for the day of my old flip phone, there are also those times when I'm glad that I have access to maps to get me to the destination that I want to get to, or FaceTime so I can see my granddaughter who lives far from me. There are good things that are there. So rather than just writing it all off and saying, let's fast from it, let's put it aside, instead we say, no, we need to know how to take control of it. We need to learn how to use it for the purposes that we want to use them. One of the exercises we did that is another one that has really stuck with me was to rearrange the apps on your phone. We tried to suggest putting a picture as your wallpaper on your phone. That's something that would remind you, call you to what's really important in life. In my case, it's a family picture with my little granddaughter on it. And then what I have done is taken all of those apps and moved them aside so that when I open up my phone, instead of seeing all these apps clamoring for my attention, here's Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever it may be, instead what I see is my family. And if I want to open up an app, I have to go and find it. So it reminds me again, this is a tool to use for what I want to accomplish. And what's really important to me is what I see first when I pick up my phone. So it's not that we want to get rid of the phone. It's not what we want to say, let's go back and be Luddites and forget all of this. It's rather to say, this is part of God's creation too, and we can use it for good. We can use it to help us.
The two words I kept coming back to throughout the week were attentiveness and intentionality. So first, are we aware of how we're using our phones and how we might experience the moments of the day with or without them? And second, that intentionality piece. When I open my phone, I have to have a distinct purpose, not just let the app chirp at me with a notification and go to like something, but I want to be intentional about saying I'm opening the phone to do this, and that's an act of reclaiming it.
One of our exercises really got directly at that as well, and that was a call that day every time you open an app to ask yourself two questions. First, what is my goal for opening this app? What do I want to accomplish? And then second, how do I know when I've accomplished that goal? So it might be that I'm at the end of a long day and I do want to take 15 minutes to look through my Facebook feed and just see what has been going on. It's a little decompression time. But when I open that up, I say, that's my goal. I want to give myself 15 minutes to just decompress. How do I know when that's up? How am I going to know when it's 15 minutes and it hasn't been an hour and 15 minutes? That's the challenge. So it's that intentionality of saying, why am I opening up this app? What do I want to accomplish? And how do I know I've done it so that I can then put my phone away?
So we gathered several participants, students and staff who engaged in this retreat for the week, and just kind of debriefed and gathered some of our insights, and some of what they said we've already reflected in our comments. But anything else that struck you about what students and staff reported, confessed, realized in that time we had to debrief?
I think one of the biggest things that we saw was how much use there is of the phone, how many times people do pick up the phone. I think that first week when we encouraged them to use those apps that tracked, they were astonished. One of the students, I think, made note that he was spending about 4 hours a day on his phone, and it shocked him, and then he started to realize, yeah, he actually was. And so some of the practices were helping him to be more attentive and more purposeful. But I think one of the big things was just that recognition of how much use the smartphone gets, how many times people check just to see, is there some new feed? Is there something going on? I got to pick it up and check.
I think for me, part of what struck me too was just anytime you talk about this topic, we wondered how many people are going to show up. A lot of people showed up. Like, this is a really personal, important topic for a lot of people. You start talking about technology and phones at a church group, and all of a sudden everyone is engaged and they have stories and they're worried about this or that. And so it's something that is really new that I think we need to be better equipped to have conversation about. And it's not just a generational thing. So it's not like the old, the kids these days kind of thing. There are plenty of baby boomers who are distracted at the table too, and it's everybody. It's really a human experience, and it's new for all of us. And so I think it just was an urgency that we need to think through. How do we navigate and kind of mitigate against some of the overwhelming characteristics and features of the digital age? And of course, I think that the Christian faith and the Christian traditions and these spiritual practices actually give us lots of tools that we can adapt to have a well-ordered life that is satisfying the way, life was intended. I think, so where I say it's not a generational thing, in some ways it is. So I had the privilege of traveling to China 2 years ago, and I had this image that I remember I would do FaceTime with my family across the earth, right? It's nighttime there, daytime where I am. And I can remember having crystal clear FaceTime conversation with my grandparents, my wife, and my kids. So literally my grandparents who are in their 90s on the left-hand side, my wife in the middle, and my 2 daughters who are elementary and preschool age. And here we were having this live conversation, crystal clear, talking about my day, the previous day. And it just struck me, I was talking to my grandparents. When they were young, my grandpa was in World War II, and he corresponded through letters when he was in the South Pacific. And just everything that he has seen and she has seen in one lifetime. Then I think about my daughters. They don't know anything else. So for them, an iPhone and a smartphone and taking pictures, it's just a given. It just exists just like electricity. And then there's my wife in the middle, and she's the part of the straddle generation, is what it's called. People who can remember what it was like before the digital age, and who are navigating the digital age. And so people in their kind of mid-30s, millennials, we're the last people to remember what it was like before. And I think that it's just striking that probably what our role as a generation, those of us in our 30s, will be remember what it was like before, not necessarily like it was better, but just remember that it used to be different. And these disciplines, I think, give us a chance to have something that's different. So when you fast, you're like, oh, this is what it's like to feel this way for a couple of days. And so what I think at the end of the day is it helps us be called out to something better and different and very countercultural, really, to what life is like in kind of a frenzied digital world.
So we happen to do this in this moment where we have increased awareness in public life about the effect that smartphones and things like Facebook have on us. There's new awareness, a lot of it tracing back to the 2016 presidential election, about the way Facebook operates, the way it can be abused, the way all these products have been designed in some ways to manipulate us. I sent around an article, and we'll post it in our show notes, called An Apology from the Internet by the People Who Built It, where former Silicon Valley insiders confess about how they built these products and the problems that they see with them. And one of the points they make is that there was this utopian culture that was foundational to Silicon Valley, where they said, well, of course, if we make technological products that can connect people better, of course the result will be better because people will always have good intentions. And Aaron, you wrote back and made an interesting comment saying this is part of the problem is bad theology and bad worldview. Explain what you mean.
Well, I think if you look back, and I've read some of the documents and of the idea behind this, it's kind of naive about what human nature is, and it ignores the duality of our brokenness and our image bearing of Christ. And so to think that if we could just get a tool that it would be used well without negative consequences is just, it's actually a little ignorant. And so I think that's, again, where I think a theology of who we are and who God is and where we are in the world helps us to think about how should we design tools. You know, something we think about in making products is, will it make money? But I think a Christian business person would say, is this a valuable contribution to society? Where could it be abused? Where could it be used? So I think that theology of who God is and who we are and what's possible, and frankly, just to look at history and the use of tools and the way that we shape tools and they shape us.
I think with that, there's also that recognition that that sin and good dwell together. Evil and good are intertwined so often. So we have seen that all through history. We see this in the use of technology, that something that is created with this utopian idea and it's going to be used for good does get used for good. You are able to talk with your family from China, but with it is also the evil intertwining itself closely at hand. So, for example, the point of these different apps is to get you to use them, and they want to keep you using them. And it's a nice thing to be able to have that access, but the ones who are creating it are also trying to draw you in, get you to buy other products. There's all kinds of ways that these fit together. With the 2016 elections, another one where how these things can be used for different purposes. Sometimes even the good intentions go astray.
And I think it's famously known that Steve Jobs would not allow his kids to use an iPad. So you have this real contradiction in kind of business practices maybe and personal use or recognition. So I think that's just striking, and maybe more and more of that is coming out as you hear about a place called the Center for Humane Technology, which is a place, people who've worked in Silicon Valley saying we can design things differently that helps humanity in a better way than we've maybe done in the past. But we're also learning about these tools as they're created. I mean, you're experimenting and then you learn about their influences. So there's something psychologists call the disinhibition effect, which is when you're not physically embodied next to somebody, you're less inhibited to say something negative or positive. So the fact that I say something on your news feed and I don't have to actually make eye contact with you and watch you cringe, it frees me up a little bit. And there's even a rush that you can get from doing that. So again, it doesn't mean that the media itself is necessarily bad, but we need to be aware of what these effects can be, and then choose where to interact and how to interact. And there's a lot that comes from that.
In this article about the Silicon Valley insiders making these confessions, they're very frank about how these products were designed to manipulate, and you get this sense of forces beyond our control. So one of them says, Facebook is a fundamentally addictive product that is designed to capture as much of your attention as possible without any regard for the consequences. And another says of Facebook, but could be said of other things, of smartphones, it was the most effective product ever created to revolve around human emotions. So we are having this reckoning now, and this very public reckoning, and I find myself going back and forth between thinking there's this bigger problem that they have to fix. Mark Zuckerberg has to fix this. And then going back to thinking, in the spirit of the smartphone retreat, I have to get my own house in order too. Now, I realize both are true, but do you realize a tension there and maybe even a danger of us saying, well, that's their problem over in Silicon Valley that they have to figure out. And at the same time, we can't be naive and think, well, if I get my own spiritual smartphone practices in order, everything will be fine. Is there a tension there?
Yes, that's a short answer, right, Nathan? Yeah, there's a tension. I mean, you set it up nicely there. I think there's a tendency for us, maybe in mainstream culture, to be uncomfortable with the word sin. And sin is something that's out there. And that's true. It is present in structural inequalities. It's true in all kinds of things. But we have to recognize it in ourselves as well. And so sometimes the issue is ourselves. So it's our own insecurity posting something on Facebook to get the dopamine hit every time someone clicks like, right? And so we have to be aware of that and recognize that kind of where our security can come from and where our identity can come from. So, yeah, I think it's a both and. And again, the spiritual practices are intended not to be pious for its sake, but they're there to give us habits to help us be more likely to do the right thing. And so having a morning habit where you write what you're thankful for instead of checking your Facebook feed, you're more likely to be thankful. You still get it wrong, but it's just making it more likely than not that we will be able to navigate a difficult environment. My sense is too is I don't want to come across as saying that things are getting worse or that things weren't bad in the past. I mean, there's all kinds of things that have changed our worlds and have been dangerous for us to interact with. Technology in the digital age is newer, so it seems fresher and more urgent, but all kinds of stuff has been shaping us.
It's also important to address this tension in community. I think you're right, Aaron, with some of those practices. They're really important as an individual to address them, but we also need to do it in community. So to do a smartphone retreat allows us initially to do our own thing, but to come together and talk about it. What does this mean? We can do this in our congregations. We can do this in small groups. We can do this from a pulpit or in a place where we're able to teach and to talk about the relationship of sin and evil and how this tension, yes, it's in Silicon Valley, and how do they create these apps and how do they work? And the line that Manoush Zomorodi said that calling customers users is only done by drug dealers and technologists. There's some truth in that, but there's also that responsibility we bear. So if we come together and talk about what does that mean for us? How do we use technology well? How do we use our smartphones well? And make that part of our conversation in community. It will help us address it on our level, and as well as hopefully having an effect on those in Silicon Valley coming up with these apps that are competing for our attention.
So that begins to answer my last question, but that is, for students who have participated in this event here and are going to go out and lead church communities, or perhaps listeners listening to this who want to try this or something like this in their own churches, their own workplaces, their own homes, we're going to compile and post all these ideas so that listeners can use them that way. What effect do you hope to have? How do you hope that leaders who have experienced this here will use that in their churches or communities in the future? And for other listeners who are considering this, what effect do you suggest that this could have in their communities?
I know that in the retreat that we did, we had one of our participants, one of our students, who was a distance student, who opened this up to some others in her congregation, said, if you'd like to participate, we can do this together. Another one of our students, also a distant student, said, can I use this this fall in my congregation? Can I do a retreat like this? And the obvious answer is yes. We'd love to have others participate, make this better. This was just kind of a first attempt. Let's see what this looks like. As I talked with students and said, what do you think about your use of smartphones, and do we need to address it, and should we do a retreat? That was a resounding yes. So the hope is not necessarily that everybody's going to do exactly what we did, but rather that in those communities, in congregations and in other gatherings of believers, there's a conversation that goes on, that we aren't just blindly using the smartphone and using the technology just because it's there, but we're asking those questions. Why are we using this? What's the purpose behind it? How can we use it better? How can it be a tool for the work of the kingdom of God? This belongs to God too. How do we use it as good and faithful stewards and disciples of Christ?
Aaron, you compiled a book list, and we're going to post that in our show notes. Can you tell us about 2 or 3 books on your list, a little bit about what they say and why we should check them out? Yeah,
so you should read them all, first of all, right?
Since I'm not using my smartphone as much, I have more time.
I know, you got all this time to read. So there's a few out there. If you're interested in these kind of addictive features of smartphones and you want to really do a deep dive in that, Adam Adler wrote a book called Irresistible, The Rise of Addictive Technology and the Business of Keeping Us Hooked. And so he does a diagnosis of what we talked about in much more detail. And so sometimes knowing and recognizing what those features are disarms them a little bit. But then he also comes to some conclusions at the end about how can we mitigate against these factors, because just human ability to resist temptation is not as good as it could be, right? So there's these other things.
And I wanted to say on that, as we've been talking about addiction and dopamine hits and things like that, people might think that language is a little exaggerated. But as you hear these people talk about it, especially those who were involved in designing the products, that's exactly the way they tried to design these products to manipulate or to take advantage of, to exploit human behavior, human psychology, and even biochemical reactions in the body. So it's not an exaggeration, as I assume this book would bear out.
Right, and maybe some that takes some of the shame away from, I'm embarrassed at how much I'm using this. Well, there's good reason why you're using it this much. And so that's a good one. I think the other one that I'll just say, again, you can see a whole bunch on there, is Andy Crouch wrote a book called The Tech-Wise Family, Everyday Steps for Putting Technology in Its Proper Place. Now, it talks about the family, but it doesn't have to be like this nuclear family. The practices could be anybody. But he sets up some good guiding questions for how to kind of discern whether you're using technology well or whether it's kind of using you. And so it gives you good guiding questions at the beginning. And then he gives ideas for what he's done with his family. It's great in true humility. At the end of each chapter, he's like, well, here's the real story. We tried to do this, but this is what it looked like in our house. We tried to have no screens until a certain age. But this is practically what it looked like. So it's a great kind of accessible how-to, and gives you some ideas for practical steps. That's where I got the idea of just do something other than check your work email right when you wake up. Anything. Just even if it's 5 minutes, just do something. So those kinds of ideas that can have some power are in there.
And for these exercises we've talked about and these resources you're mentioning, the encouraging thing to me was that these things are realistic. First of all, they're doable. And second of all, everyone is honest about the fact that there will be setbacks. You're not going to master this overnight, again, because it's so ingrained into our behavior. But that's okay, and it's a progression. There's an analogy or maybe a direct connection to sanctification, that we keep getting better. 2 steps forward, 1 step back on a good day, maybe the other way around. But that's how this goes. And so to me, it felt accessible. It felt doable. I'm not going to get it perfect right away, but this is something that I can do. So Jeff and Aaron, thanks for your leadership on this, for your wisdom, for your practical suggestions, and thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to the Forum Podcast. To learn more, go to theforum.calvinseminary.edu.